Now, let me introduce our special presenter for today. Nancy Mowll Mathews began her studies of Mary Cassatt and French and American Impressionism with her PhD dissertation for the Institute of Fine Arts in NYU. Of the more than 15 books and exhibitions she has produced on this subject, the best known are Cassatt and Her Circle, Selected Letters, Cassatt, The Color Prints, and Mary Cassatt, A Life. More recently, she has curated and co-wrote the catalog for Mary Cassatt, an American Impressionist in Paris, for the Jacques-Marc-André Museum in Paris in 2018. And most recently, she has written an essay for our exhibition catalog for this exhibit, which you can purchase on our website. She is the Emerita Eugenie Prendergast Senior Curator of 19th and 20th Century Art at the Williams College Museum of Art, and also taught in the Williams College Art Department and Graduate Program. In addition to her work on Cassatt, she is the co-author of the Prendergast Catalogue Raisonné and numerous other books on Maurice and Charles Prendergast. Charles is also in our collection now at the museum, Paul Gauguin, and the relationship between art and early film. And tonight's presentation by Nancy is Cassatt, Morisot, and the Impressionist Matriarchy. I cannot wait to hear it. Nancy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And I want to also thank Ann Cannon, Martha Membrino, and everyone at the Fenimore Art Museum for giving me this opportunity to do a project that I always wanted to do. That is, to go on a deep dive into the personal and artistic relationship between Mary Cassatt and Berthe Morisot. And I'm going to share. I hope everybody can see that. This has been an era of art historical research and major museum exhibitions of other Impressionist relationships. Cassatt and Degas at the National Gallery, Degas and Manet at the Met, and the upcoming show this fall of Morisot and Manet. Now we have this exhibition of Cassatt and Morisot, and I hope it opens a new wave of research into these extraordinary artists. And I'm showing you installation shots from the exhibition that's up now at the Fenimore Museum. Normally, you all would be there and you would know that, but who knows where you are and whether you'll actually get to see the exhibition. But this is what it looks like. So, as many of you know, I have been researching and writing about Cassatt since my dissertation, which was completed for the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU, in 1980, if you can believe that. For those of you who can't count, like me, that's over 50 years, including the research and writing years. In all that time, I thought I knew Morisot too. It's really deceptive. If you work on one artist who is closely related to another, you think you know all about them. But now I know how much I didn't know about her, Morisot, and the relationship between the two. I would like to thank the Morisot scholars, who are too numerous to name, but particularly Bill Scott, who has been a real friend to my Morisot research and to the museum as a lender to this exhibition. Berthe Morisot and Mary Cassatt were the children of privilege. I'm just going to get rid of myself. Not only had their parents achieved a comfortable level of wealth and culture, but they benefited from the international women's movement gaining speed in the 1840s, the decade in which they were born. They were well educated, spoke several languages, and had the support of their parents when they decided in their teens to become professional artists. Morisot was 3 years older than Cassatt. When these photographs were taken in Paris, they probably had not yet met, although their paths may have crossed while copying in the Louvre, or because both were beginning to exhibit in the Salon. Both were slim and graceful, well-dressed, and comfortable with posing for their portraits. You will hear a little later this summer a talk by Justine de Young on their fashions. But let's take a quick look now at how they compare in their mid to late 20s. Morisot, with her elaborate hairstyle, rococo setting, that is the chair and the background, and flirtatious pose, certainly out-Parises Cassatt, with her broad face, simple hair, and plain background. Cassatt's direct gaze at the photographer makes her seem open and honest, qualities seemingly American. If you look closely at their clothes, however, Morisot has saved the simplicity for her dress compared to Cassatt's. It's similar, they're similar, both dresses are similar in cut and fabric, but Morisot's has a much better fit, showing her innate confidence. Cassatt, on the other hand, almost seems like she's trying too hard, with a fussy jabot, jet-decorated sloping shoulders, key at her waist, and fan in her hands. The dress doesn't seem to fit quite properly. There are too many wrinkles in the bodice compared to Morisot's. And it just reminds you that Cassatt actually ordered clothes in Paris for her sister and her friends, and often wore them before she sent them home to them. So who knows whose dress this was. But the details, it's like she's adopting identifiable French decorative symbols rather than letting her elegant silhouette speak for itself, as Morisot has done. These cultural differences play out in different ways in the almost 20 years that we can trace their relationship and their aesthetic preferences. In my talk today, I will explore those with you. I will explore with you the evolution of their style within the Impressionist context and over those 20 years. But in addition, we will examine the power they both exerted in their different ways to enhance the movement and make it internationally successful. Part 1, Women Artists in Paris. Although the 1870s opened with widespread destruction in Paris during the Franco-Prussian War, it soon became a decade of great cultural energy for that city, particularly in the fine arts. Morisot exhibited this monumental pastel portrait of her sister Edma in the Salon of 1872, and Cassatt, who had returned to the US to avoid the war, came back quickly and exhibited her carnival scene on the right in that same Salon exhibition. Along the lines of the two photographs we were just looking at, Morisot's figure is relatively plain, while the background and hair are complex and decorative. Cassatt's carnival scene, painted in Parma, Italy, is the opposite. The clothing and gestures of the figures are almost fussy, but the background is plain. The modern costume, light background, and pastel colors of Morisot's work show the influence of the new painting as proposed by Manet and Degas, who were now her friends. Cassatt's painting, on the other hand, shows mastery of movement and two-figure composition, developed through her study of old masters such as Correggio in Parma, but also her pre-war studies in Paris with genre painters and Thomas Couture. Interestingly, they have both adopted something of each other's presentation of the figure in the photographs. Morisot's sister now looks straight out at the artist, while Cassatt's carnival goers are turned away, throwing flowers in a flirtatious gesture. While both artists are constantly learning and experimenting, they continue to represent large, strong female figures with expressive faces. By 1874, the artistic divide between them had increased. Cassatt was only occasionally in Paris as she traveled to study the art museums in Italy, Spain, and the Low Countries. Often she traveled alone, navigating the train system, museums, and artist studios. Occasionally, her mother, who loved Europe and learned French as a child, came over to accompany her and pose for her as a kind of portable model. Her mother is on the left. Every year, Cassatt would send works to the annual Salon, as well as other major exhibitions on both sides of the Atlantic, and became well known in her own country. She painted Ida, which is on the right, showed it in the Salon of 1874, and learned later that Degas had noticed it in the Salon and saw it in it an artistic kinship. Going from Cassatt's works in 1873 to 4 to Morisot's makes us feel once again that the two are on different planets. Morisot stayed in Paris with a trip to Spain in the summer of 1872 and travels around France. Her increasing modernism, however, caused Salon juries to reject her, and with the formation of the Impressionist independent exhibitions, she began to exhibit with that group in 1874 at the invitation of Degas. Two of the works in the first Impressionist show of 1874 were nothing like Cassatt's, these two works. The one on the left, it was possibly in the exhibition. You know, they only listed the works by title. There weren't any photographs in the catalog, so we were not sure exactly which works were in there. But we are sure about the one on the right. And it was owned and lent by Manet. Comparing Morisot's depiction of her own mother with Cassatt's, it is clear that Cassatt has mastered expressive portraiture, but Morisot has placed her mother in a modern place and time. If we compare Ida to Morisot's painting, we also wonder how Degas saw in Cassatt the possibility of becoming an Impressionist painter. And yet he did. 3 years later, Cassatt was a convert. Gone is the dark black background and fuzzy costume. Like Morisot, Cassatt had begun to be rejected by the Salon for her lighter, more modern palette, and she even tried an experiment by darkening the background of a rejected picture and had it accepted the following year. By 1877, when both of her works were rejected, Degas invited her to exhibit with the group in their next show, which was going to be in 1878. This portrait of her mother may have been intended for that exhibition, but when the show was canceled, she sent it instead to her brother in Philadelphia, who often lent it to important exhibitions in the U.S. In 1877, Cassatt encouraged her friend Louisine Havemeyer to buy a work by Degas, and she told her biographer years later that she spent her time studying his work. And certainly reading the newspaper had become an important theme for many in the Impressionist group, particularly Degas, and she told her biographer, but the relationship of this painting to Morisot's painting of her own mother is intriguing. As important as Degas was to Cassatt's conversion to Impressionism, and as close a friend and colleague as he became over the years, I feel that Cassatt's study of Morisot has not been fully appreciated in this conversion. Morisot's work had been exhibited first in the Salon of 1870, which Cassatt knew well since she was in Paris and had her own painting included that year. After that, it remained with Edma, Morisot's sister, who Cassatt got to know once she actually met Berthe. In addition, Cassatt knew how well reviewed Morisot was within the Impressionist exhibitions and how quickly her work sold. Cassatt always kept her eye on other successful women in Paris. One purchaser, Ernest Ochdet, had to sell his collection of Impressionist works in 1878, and from that sale, Cassatt bought a Morisot and a Monet while she was working on this portrait. In 1879, Cassatt visited Morisot at home to try to convince her to lend works to the upcoming Fourth Impressionist exhibition. Morisot's studio was in her own family's apartment and was a site of entertaining, and Cassatt might have had a good chance to examine what Morisot was working on, perhaps this painting. The two works side by side, although never exhibited side by side, show an extraordinary relationship between the two artists, and Cassatt's might be considered an homage to Morisot for bringing her into this unique circle of artists. As she wrote to Morisot later that year, quote, "I am very envious of your talent, I assure you," unquote. Part 2, in the group. Once Cassatt was accepted into the list of exhibitors for upcoming Impressionist shows, she began with the fourth in 1879. She began to take a role similar to what Morisot's had been in the previous 4 years. She was quickly introduced to the circle of intellectuals that attended the family dinners hosted by Morisot's and Manet's mothers. The group included Manet and Degas, of course, but also literary figures, Baudelaire, Mallarmé, and Zola, and such international celebrities as Clemenceau and Whistler. Morisot and Cassatt also began to host their own afternoons, and the artists visited each other's studios. The two women were almost 40 when they began exhibiting together in the group. They had family responsibilities. Morisot was married to Manet's brother and had a child. Cassatt was now living with her parents and sister, whose health was declining. Cassatt's sister Lydia died in late 1882, and Morisot's now brother-in-law, Edouard Manet, died 5 months later in 1883. As Morisot wrote after Manet's funeral, the group seemed like, quote, one big family mourning one of their own. Although these two portraits may have been painted as much as 10 years apart, the Manet portrait of Morisot and the Degas portrait of Cassatt show two serious women on the go, negotiating their responsibilities out in the world. From the first, Morisot was viewed as prominent in the group, reviewed and sold well. Mallarmé wrote about her in 1874 as one of the leaders. When Cassatt joined, she was mostly an unknown figure to the Impressionist audience, but she quickly took on a managerial role, encouraging Morisot to exhibit in 1879 and taking responsibility for the survival of the exhibitions. As she wrote to J. Alden Weir, an American artist interested in the new style, quote, "You know how hard it is to inaugurate anything like independent action among French artists, and we, the Impressionists, are carrying on a despairing fight." Degas' portrait of Cassatt is reminiscent of his friend Marcellin Deboutin's portrait of Morisot from 1876, when Deboutin exhibited with her and Degas in the second Impressionist exhibition. The two women both casually lean forward, confident and at ease with the artist. Morisot, however, is, quote, at home, seemingly our hostess. Well-dressed, coiffed, and toying with a fan, she welcomes us to her personal world. Cassatt, on the other hand, dressed for the outdoors with scarf and hat, is portrayed as, quote, a visitor, looking at photographs, seemingly in Degas' studio on professional business. In art world terms, a well-dressed visitor like this in your studio could be a colleague, or perhaps a collector or dealer, and Cassatt's efforts to place Degas' work with American collectors made her, in a sense, all of the above. Deboutin's prints of fellow artists And by the way, we don't know of a portrait of Cassatt that de Bottin did, although she did a painted portrait of him. So there should be one somewhere. These portraits, de Bottin's portraits, provide context for Degas' etching an aquatint, quote-unquote, portrait of Cassatt, which he did in 2 versions, showing her with her sister studying art in 2 different galleries of the Louvre. Mary Cassatt at the Louvre was made for a never-published print journal that they called Le Jour et la Nuit, which showed various Parisian scenes throughout the day, such as touring the Louvre and an evening at the theater. It was a, quote, impressionist or, quote, modern reworking of a typical Paris guidebook, celebrating Paris, but in a sense also geared toward the visitor to town. A key element in these prints was the depiction of light. In Degas' composition, it's daylight. The light and dark are intertwined shapes, while in Cassatt's, the artificial light of the theater washes over the whole to the extent that the face is almost featureless. It is not surprising, then, given the theme of the print journal, that Cassatt would continue on with the concept of the visitor. Even within the home, she focuses not on the hostess, but on the woman coming in from the outside, wearing hat and gloves, always the observer. This is how Degas portrayed her, the typical American tourist to the Louvre, needing her sister to read to her from the guidebook. In contrast to Morisot, who had already found her seat, Cassatt and her avatars, her figures representing her, was moving her seat around to find just the right spot. While often critics saw La Parisienne in Cassatt's work, Cassatt herself explored the theme of the outsider. Sometimes she used her sister or other American family members spending time in Paris as her models, but as the one on the left, the cup of tea. But just as often, she hired models, such as in Young Girl at a Window, dressing them in her own, on the right, dressing them in her own clothes, having them hold her own dog. The expression of the figure, both face and body, is attentive, contemplative, seemingly processing the novelty in front of her eyes. Compare Morisot's treatment of this subject, painted while spending the summer in the countryside outside of Paris, actually not far from where the Cassatts were staying and socializing often. Morisot's hired model, probably also dressed in Morisot's own clothes, is obscured by the soft brushstrokes of Morisot's airy style. She painted with air. We can't tell if she's a visitor. She has no hat, but perhaps gloves and decorative scarf are a sign she's a visitor. And we can't get a clear sense of her attentiveness to the tea party in front of her. If she is a visitor, she doesn't have the correctness of Cassatt's Americans, but instead has the relaxed air of a young relative with no part in the conversation. If we can trust the dates of these respective works, Morisot might be returning the compliment, inspired by Cassatt to explore the tea party and the expressive imagery of the visitor, now an homage to Cassatt. As the Impressionist exhibitions drew to a close with the eighth one in 1886, the group would no longer be treated as a whole, and individual artists began to carve out their separate audiences with identifiable styles. Morisot grew closer to Renoir and began to study the brushwork of 18th century French artists such as Boucher and Fragonard. Again, in comparison to the Cassatt composition of this same subject, Morisot uses her almost Rococo brushstrokes to activate the foreground and background. She was often praised for continuing to study the Impressionist brushstroke, while others moved on to other styles. Cassatt, on the other hand, built on her study of printmaking from the project with Degas, circa 1880, and introduced a firmer structure of the figures, but utilizes a sense of incompleteness to the composition that makes everything on the surface seem fleeting. In the 1886 exhibition, Cassatt showed a toilette scene, unusual for her, but consistent with Degas' new series of bathers that had drawn her attention. The deliberate awkwardness of many of Degas' poses contradicted the eroticism of such subjects. Cassatt experimented with this contradiction herself, choosing an ungainly model and, as she told her biographer, putting all the beauty into her art. Just look at that hand and that arm. That's the beauty she's talking about. And of course, the lines of the gown. Degas was so taken with this work that he exchanged it for this one of his on the left. Cassatt was pleased to hear that when his collection, Degas' collection, was cataloged after his death, that at first, when they were cataloging, they thought her work was by him. The stories of these two paintings are compelling and speak volumes about the Degas-Cassatt relationship. However, the stories have for too long overshadowed the more pertinent relationship between Cassatt's toilette scene and Morisot's The Bath, that also hung in the 8th Impressionist exhibition. Morisot had often done toilette scenes, and Cassatt owned an early one, as we saw. But the similarities between these two works make The Bath stand out from Morisot's usual treatment of this subject. Its simplicity of background and emphasis on the athletic pose and physique of the model is more like what Cassatt was doing. It is beautiful and graceful compared to Cassatt's deliberate highlighting of the skimpy hair and scrawny neckline of her model, highlighting the artist's individuality. Yet the pose gives the two works an undeniable relationship. This pairing is impressive, and as Impressionism takes its final bow as an exhibiting society, the two artists show that they are indeed independent major figures, valuing each other and not just followers of the men in the group. Their alliance, as Fenimore's exhibition stresses, was beneficial to both of them, as well as to the group as a whole. Their leadership and belief in the cause can also be seen in their hosting of the group in regular social functions and their financial contributions to the exhibition expenses. As powerful matriarchs, now approaching 50, they assured the survival of the movement in practical as well as artistic ways. Part 3, Going International. (1886) also saw the first major exhibition of Impressionism in New York, marking the official debut of the movement across the Atlantic. So far, we have followed the American Cassatt as visitor in the French cultural sphere, which was so dominated by the French Morisot, whose family, training, and intelligence made her the ultimate Parisienne. From this time on, though, Morisot gets a taste of how a French female artist succeeds in the American art milieu. Although she never traveled to the U.S., her work began being marketed there by the Durand-Ruel galleries. Morisot had been introduced to the idea of exhibiting in the U.S. by her own brother, Tiburce, who in 1883 had a project to arrange such an exhibition of Impressionism. When Durand-Ruel instead successfully managed to open 2 such shows in New York in 1886, he included 9 paintings by Morisot. Oddly, Cassatt, who had helped him navigate the New York art world, had none in the first show and only 2 in the second, including the portrait of her mother that was lent by her brother in Philadelphia. The Morisots were well reviewed and many sold, including this work on the left, which is believed to be the one bought by the American artist William Merritt Chase. As Chase was a teacher of many women artists, it is significant that Morisot's work was in his collection for them to study. The next year, 1887, Durand-Ruel showed Morisot's work again in New York, and when he opened a permanent gallery there in 1888, he kept a healthy inventory of her paintings, often on view. Morisot's interest in showing outside of France is also attested to by the fact that she often sent work to the annual exhibition of Les 20, or the 20, in Belgium, while Cassatt did not, complaining that she did not have enough works in her possession. Thus, in the late 1880s, Cassatt focused primarily on exhibiting in Paris, while Morisot explored markets in other countries as Impressionism spread around the world. This changed for Cassatt in 1890, when Durand-Ruel, the dealer, began to make a concerted effort to promote her work in her own country. When he launched his new art newspaper, L'Art dans les deux mondes, or Art in the Two Worlds, that is Europe and America, to increase the art traffic between France and the United States, he featured one of Cassatt's new dry points on the cover, on the right. Cassatt's series of 12 dry points were sold as a set by Durand-Ruel, were exhibited in a modern print show at his gallery, and became very successful. The École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the Academy of Fine Arts, that is, acquired a set, marking the first time that Cassatt's work entered an institution. A few months later, Durand-Ruel featured a drawing by Morisot on the cover, and the first monographic article on her work by a friend of Mallarmé's, Théodore de Visaval. The article caught the attention of the American artistic world, and it was quickly translated into English and published in the Chautauquan, which is, quote, by their own explanation, quote, a monthly magazine devoted to the promotion of true culture, unquote. The interest in Berthe Morisot due to this article was such that it was a given that the educated public would know it. At a party in Green Bay, Wisconsin, newspaper article on the right describes it. The young gentlemen at the party were challenged to name the publication each young lady was dressed as. You can see some of the other names in the of publications in the article. But one of them was Berthe Morisot, the artist Madame Berthe Morisot. Crazy. As much as Cassatt had exhibited in the U.S. throughout her career to this point, her name and physical appearance were not nearly so recognized, nor were any of the other Impressionists. It is unclear, however, how Morisot's appearance would have become so well known to the party guests in Green Bay, because the picture was not reproduced in the Chautauquan. Perhaps someone subscribed to L'Art dans les deux mondes and saw her as the mother teaching her child to sew. Perhaps a local collector had a print of Manet's portrait of Morisot, which he had done in 1872, somewhere around 1872 to 4. The print had been recently published in a large edition in 1884. Or, and this is kind of a stretch, the collection to buy Manet's Olympia, which started in 1889, was written about extensively in U.S. newspapers. Morisot was known to be working with Monet and Caillebotte to raise the funds, and she became associated with the risque model of the work, perhaps. Motherly, fashionable, or sexy, Morisot embodied the feminine to Americans, as de Visebo wrote about her in his article. As Morisot's chic feminine persona helped make Impressionism known even to the young people of Green Bay, Wisconsin, Cassatt's contribution to the international spread of the movement was more practical. In 1892, in 1892, she was asked to paint a mural for the Women's Building of the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. Her theme was to be, quote, modern woman, and the imagery centered on, quote, women picking fruit from the tree of knowledge, or the spread of women's educational opportunities in the late 19th century. Luckily for Cassatt, the theme of women picking fruit was explored by other Impressionist artists, such as Degas, Pissarro, and Morisot. Morisot particularly was working on several canvases of this subject in 1891, with some later sketches in 1892. Once again, Cassatt and Morisot were able to study each other's work, this time with special meaning to women, and Cassatt's finished product reflects her own artistic personality. Stylishly dressed, but monumental in effect, Cassatt's women were likened to priestesses when shown in Paris in 1893. The mural itself, raised high above the floor in the tympanum of the Hall of Honor of the Women's Building, was difficult for viewers and critics to decipher. Although Cassatt had made a monumental statement in modern terms about women sharing the fruits of knowledge, it was not a critical success. Nevertheless, Cassatt became well known in the United States and began to have major solo exhibitions in Paris, New York, and Boston, giving Impressionism the quote-unquote American identity it had lacked. Cassatt brought with her all the Impressionists who she had promoted to the major American collectors she came to know, including Louisine Havemeyer, whose collection formed the basis for the Metropolitan Museum's major Impressionism collection. Cassatt's role in the international spread of Impressionism cannot be overstated. Havemeyer's role as a promoter of women's suffrage, here passing the torch, can be read as a later version of Cassatt's passing the fruit from the tree of knowledge. Interesting footnote, Havemeyer did not acquire a Morisot, although she wrote about her positively in her memoir. Some have interpreted this as Cassatt's giving a boost to the men in the group, as she advised American collectors, but not the women. But other collectors in Cassatt's circle did buy works by Morisot, such as Sarah Sears, the work on the left belonged to her, and Harris Whittemore, the work on the right. Both of them were friends of Cassatt's and brought together very nice Impressionist collections in the United States. As anyone knows who produces work for the public's approval, even the best of friends cannot help but compete. The number of times Cassatt and Morisot painted the same subject can be seen as friendly rivalry. But a slight of attention, such as Morisot not receiving a congratulatory note from Cassatt on her 1892 exhibition, caused hurt feelings. And around the same time, 1892, Morisot made a comment about Cassatt's young women picking fruit. As Cassatt wrote to the director of the Carnegie Museum, who bought the work in 1922, Degas liked the work, but, quote, he had spoken of the picture to Berthe Morisot, who did not like it. I can understand that, she said philosophically. But Degas did like it, and it was now being bought by a museum. She wrote, quote, if it has stood the test of time and is well drawn, its place in a museum might show the present generation that we worked and learned our profession, which isn't a bad thing. Morisot, too, had a role in the placement of Impressionist works in important collections. When Manet died, for instance, she and her husband bought many of the works that they then gave to artists they felt should have an example of Manet's work. Eugène Manet, Morisot's husband, inherited the family's estate after the deaths of his brothers, which gave them extra money for philanthropy. The effort to raise enough money to donate Manet's Olympia, for example, brought attention anew to the group whose status was becoming legendary. Morisot kept the group together at her Thursday night dinners and mentored her daughter, Julie, on photograph on the left, and her niece, Paul Gobillard, as they became painters themselves. When Julie Manet married Ernest Rouart, the son of the major Impressionist collector in Paris, Henri Rouart, their collection became extraordinary. And you can see some of it in the background of the photograph, along with her husband, Ernest, taking the picture in the mirror. When Julie Manet married Ernest Rouart, their collection became extraordinary, and they devoted their lives to intelligently placing the works and supporting scholarship about the Impressionists. More than any other members of the Impressionist group, Cassatt and Morisot get credit for the establishment of Impressionism as a whole, not just their own works, in museums and the public consciousness. As for their own art, they both entered the Luxembourg Museum in the 1890s as it began acquiring work by the Impressionists. This was the Museum of, quote-unquote, Museum of Modern Art, and the works from that museum would then go into the Louvre. It's the state museum system. Neither Cassatt nor Morisot were in Gustave Caillebott's collection of Impressionist paintings, which was bequeathed to the state upon his death in 1894. That year, however, the Luxembourg tried to correct that lacuna, that absence, by offering to buy works by Morisot and Cassatt. The Morisot we have seen before, the painting on the left. And its acquisition in the year before Morisot's death in 1895 was a fitting tribute to the importance of her work to Impressionism, especially in the early days of the movement. The Cassatt they wanted to buy was not in her own possession. It was owned by Duras-Ruel, so they couldn't buy it from the artist, as was their policy. And we don't know exactly what work it was that they wanted. However, like many other artists of that stature, she was able to choose what work she wanted to be in the Luxembourg. And in 1897, after the Caillebott bequest was finally approved and sent to the museum in 1896, she donated this mother and child pastel. It is interesting that she chose this intimate work for a grand public museum, rather than one of her earlier, more monumental oils from the Modern Woman series. As a pastel, it is very fragile and thus seldom exhibited, but to her, and consequently to us, it represents the tenderness of her interpretation of the mother and child. The two intertwined figures, the swooping poses, and the soft strokes throughout most of the surface. It was this subject that made her famous and collected throughout the world. The two artists embraced motherhood in their own different ways. Morisot, of course, was a mother, and her daughter, Julie Manet, was her student, her model, and the manager of her estate. Cassatt was not a mother, but she genuinely loved children, including Julie Manet, who she would scoop up and take for a gallop on her horse when she came to visit Berthe. Cassatt's many nieces and nephews also became her models, along with Cassatt's two sisters-in-law. Mothers and children populate both artists' work and add a universal dimension to the Impressionist style that it would not have had without them. They also portrayed their own mothers in important works, as we have seen. But you don't have to be an actual mother to be a matriarch, a woman of power and leadership within a group. And it's time that their position within Impressionism be recognized. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Nancy. What a wonderful presentation. And it's wonderful to learn so much more about these two very, very important artists from the Impressionist movement. Um, and if you have time, Nancy, I'm going to jump right into the questions, if you don't mind.
Sure, absolutely.
And there are some questions already in the chat. If you do have questions, again, please don't hesitate to begin typing, and we will get to as many of your questions as we possibly can. I will start with the first one that came in a little while ago from Erica. Is there any speculation or commentary on Morisot being a mother? Did it mean that she had less time or ability to produce compared to Mary Cassatt?
Well, yes, I mean, that is always, I mean, when we research women artists, we often have to take into account their traditional roles in the family. And Morisot definitely had, not only had to, but wanted to, was a devoted mother. And as I said, she actually incorporated her daughter into her work because her daughter was often her model. And so she combined her work and motherhood. Now, Mary Cassatt didn't have children, but she did have a sickly sister that it turned out Mary Cassatt was a good nurse. She was able to take care of her sister, and then until she died, and then her parents, as they aged, had many illnesses, so she had caretaking responsibilities there too. So yeah, I mean, there's no question that the women in any artistic circle um, have have more, more um, responsibility in that way.
Right. Susan would like to know a little bit more about Cassatt's experiments with pastel. She wasn't aware that Cassatt had used pastel as a medium as much as she had.
I'm keeping my PowerPoint on so that I can actually go back to some of these
Jump back
things.
for sure.
Yeah, let's see. Um, this in particular, this pastel actually is a good example. And she really learned pastel when she joined the Impressionist group. She hadn't experimented with it before that, as far as we know. Now, the one thing about Cassatt is that she she said she was doing her family a favor by destroying all of her early works. And if you're an artist and you're like, what am I going to do with all these things? Nobody wants to see the early work. So anyway, she destroyed them. So we don't know. We don't know whether she did pastel before. But Degas certainly did pastel. Morisot, entered that fabulous portrait of her sister into the Salon of 1872. So it was definitely a medium that Cassatt was dying to try. And it turns out that of her work after that, let's say after 1880, at least half of it is in pastel.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's major. You just don't see it because
Right.
it's not exhibited. Pastels are very, very light sensitive and fragile. And so they can't stay on museum walls for long periods of time.
Yeah. Speaking of Morisot and her tendency to destroy early work, I have to say one of my favorite pieces in our
Cassatt,
exhibition is
yeah,
yeah, and Cassatt, but
yeah.
Morisot destroy or repurposed one of her paintings
Right,
as a
right.
book cover.
Yes, right, she didn't destroy it, but what a smart idea,
Right.
recycling.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite
Yeah,
pieces that's in the
yeah,
show right
right.
now.
Yeah, I mean, an artist who has a huge body of work and whose studio is in the house has to do something with all that stuff. So,
Why
so
not?
for Morisot, right, to repurpose some of her canvases as book covers, brilliant, brilliant.
James has a question. A recent exhibition at London's Dulwich Gallery emphasized Morisot's connection to 18th century painting, Fragonard, etc. Do you think it would be fruitful to see Impressionism as an alternative route out of Rococo to that of academicism? And was Cassatt noticeably influenced by 18th century French or British artists?
For sure. I mean, all of the above. Everything that the question asks, yeah, the answer to everything is yes, 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 yes. Um, um, they certainly, I mean, many of Cassatt's late pastels are the result of looking at 18th century pastelists, particularly portraitists. Rosalba Carriera, for one. I mean, the women artists who worked in that medium of the 18th century. You know, you have to. These guys, or at least Cassatt, and but also more so, they just lived in museums. They loved it, and they and you know people in the homes of major collectors where they could really, you know, get up close and personal, and you know, they just loved studying art. So 18th, but you know, Cassatt, of course, starts out really primarily studying 17th century, and even, I mean, so you know, from Correggio on, but Rubens,
Mhm.
Velasquez, all of that. Uh, so you definitely see echoes of old master art in her work. But then Morisot, when around in the mid 80s, gets very interested in 18th century Boucher, Fragonard, you know, and they're because her family owned a pastel by Fragonard, it people got it into their heads, not Morisot, but other people, that she was a descendant of him. And one thing that was clarified in the catalog to that 18th century show is that there's no way that she was a descendant of Fragonard.
Hmm.
Anyway, I don't know if that answered all the parts of that question, but
I
I
think
hope
you did
that
a very
helps.
good job.
Okay.
Karen would like to know that during the era that they were painting, when women were asserting their rights beyond the home sphere, why do you think there was such an emphasis on motherhood in the pieces by Cassatt and Morisot?
Yeah, I mean, you're in a bind. Um, Either you say I'm a feminist and therefore I want to try things that women haven't traditionally done, and lots of women artists do that, and and Morisot with her toilette scenes was doing that in a way because it was it was an erotic subject, and so she was a little risque for her to do
Mhm.
that. Now, the other way you can go is to say, I'm a feminist and I'm going to celebrate women and women's lives and what's important to women. And thus you come to the, compositions of the home, of the tea party, of the mother and child, of the very, I mean, you cannot say that these are not important or eternal themes. I mean, particularly the mother and child. And as I said, Cassatt was, a student of the history of art and respected, wanted to be in museums. And so, it's partly, and this is what my dissertation was about. The mother and child was a reinterpretation, a modernization of the Madonna and Child, which had, populated museum galleries all over Europe for centuries. So she wanted to, compete with the old masters, in a modern way. So yeah, I mean, you're kind of, as a woman artist, you can go in, or as a feminist artist, not just as a woman artist, but if you really want to, um, uh, you know,
Yeah.
celebrate
Was
women, or do more than you are expected to, there you.
was their access to models more limited than the male artist would have
Yeah,
been?
well,
Yeah.
definitely nude models,
Hmm.
and certainly, you know, that changed in Cassatt's lifetime. Art students, after Cassatt, soon after Cassatt, for instance, at the Pennsylvania Academy where she studied, had access to the nude female model, but not the male, the female. But they, I mean, it was important to know the figure, and so they found ways of doing that.
Hmm.
But yes, restrictions, even though, by 1890, in the lifetime of Cassatt and Morisot, the census, the US Census shows that artists, people who claim artists, being an artist as their occupation, were 50% women by 1890. I mean, that's huge. The progress, the women just went into this field and did anything they could think of with it. So it was really a great time. Not everything, of course, was open to them, but they were, making, really, truly making progress. Now, given what's going on today in our world, where doors are closing and things are being less accessible, that does happen. By 1930, the percentage of women, of art people who put down artists as their occupation,
Hmm.
um, was much less than it was in 1890.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, things go up and down.
Right. And actually, since you just started talking about kind of contemporary issues, I'm going to take two questions here and kind of merge them together. First, Jill asks if there's any contemporary women artists whose work is influenced by Morisot and Cassatt. And then, what do you think Cassatt and Morisot would say to us as artists today, or would say to current artists?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, I I can't say that I know of contemporary women artists working today who have who would say that they have really taken Cassatt and Marceau as their guide, or as their whatever leader, inspiration. However, almost every contemporary artist, female artist, has studied Cassatt and Marceau. I mean, that's one thing about art history now. You pretty much can't go through or even survey without learning about them, which when I was taking survey, you didn't learn about them. So they're definitely part of everyone's consciousness. Now, I used to be, before, like, 20 years ago, I used to be say, yeah, I used to be able to say yes, because if they, Cassatt lived to 1926, and there were many exhibitions after her death. So many, many American artists of the 20th century actually got to study her from those exhibitions. But what would they say to women artists today? Well, I think, Cassatt was all about the work, doing the work, um, learning, studying, drawing, uh, and
Yeah.
that's the kind of thing.
I'm gonna sneak one of my questions in
Okay.
because one of my particular interests is Japanese art and the
Ah,
influence of Japanese art and culture on the
yeah.
Impressionists and Paris in general. Can you talk a little bit about how Cassatt was influenced by the Japanese art, and then how she then kind of influenced Morisot and their direction in printmaking after that 1890 show in Paris.
Yeah, well, Anne very nically wrote about that in the in the catalog. So I didn't get into that at the time, but
So order the catalog, everybody.
yeah, right. But I certainly have written a lot about, especially Cassatt's prints and
Mhm.
the importance of Japanese prints to the color print movement of the 1890s in the West. I
Hmm.
mean, it was extraordinary
Yeah.
how much it meant to Western artists to see how the Japanese traditions in popular art, it was a kind of way of making a painting without because it was colored, or the color prints were anyway. Um, and they were part of a narrative, and they showed daily, like quote unquote daily life in Japan. So so many of the artists and Japanese prints started being shown in Paris and in the United States much earlier than the 1890s show. So it was sort of part of everybody's um, study, learning different, artistic traditions and trying to break out of the academic mold and all of that.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
certainly, you know, the thing about Cassatt inviting Morisot to the 1890s show is important, just to show their relationship and how they wanted to learn from each other and they wanted to share, and it's all the related works that you can find between Cassatt and Morisot certainly speak to that relationship. But more so was also, it was a time when people were going to drawing, interested in drawing. And she began drawing more along the lines of the 18th century Fragonard, Boucher kind of thing at the encouragement of Renoir. So she was already interested in the graphic arts, drawing, to some extent, printmaking. Um, and so, but I do think she was inspired by the success pre Japanese prints, pre 1890, the series of dry points that I was talking about that Cassatt had exhibited. They were not color prints; they were just black and white prints, and but they were abstract, sort of Japanesey, but really not an overt um, connection to the Japanese color prints. And those more so, it seems to me, looked at, studied, tried her hand at something like that.
Hmm.
And she never, she really didn't get into the color print realm
Right. Right.
particularly. But anyway,
Um,
you have to look at each work, and
sure.
each one work is different. Yeah.
Nancy, so for anyone whose questions we didn't get to tonight, or for anyone who might have questions that come up later, uh, are you okay with people emailing you and asking
Yeah, I put
questions,
my
or
email in the
yeah, do you want to put up that slide one more time? I think it was on your
oh
final
sure.
slide, your email address, in case people
Yeah.
want to reach out to
Yeah, I,
you.
I always do that. So, people
Uh,
know who the heck, who was that?
And is there anything that you'd like to announce? Any current projects or anything that you're currently working on that you'd like to kind of spill the beans on or share with us? Anything? If not, that's
Well,
okay too.
this is sort of old news, but here in Bloomington at the Indiana University Museum, we did an exhibition of Monet's stepdaughter. Blanche Ochede Monet, who was a crazy character. She was the daughter of Monet's second wife. Second wife had 6 children. Monet had 2. There were 8 of them, and only one of them became an artist, and that was Blanche. But she also took care of Monet during the Second World War, or First World War, when all the other kids left town. You took their families and left, or they were in the army or something. And so I've been working on what happened to the Impressionists in their old age.
Hmm.
Certainly Cassatt, first and foremost. Who was it who took care of them? Who was it who inventoried the stuff in the studio? Who was it who dealt with the collectors and dealers who wanted to come and buy things, but the artist, him or herself, was infirm in some way. Cassatt's eyesight went. So she wasn't really, she had a hard time writing letters and she couldn't do any more work. But Monet was doing the water lilies, and so he needed a lot of help from his stepdaughter Blanche. And Renoir had, the rheumatism, was physically infirm. His son Jean Renoir, after he was in the service in the military and came out, helped Renoir. So I'm interested in artists in their old age. Degas, of course, because Cassatt was the one who got Degas' niece to come and take care of him. Um, so so anyway, I'm working on that.
That's really fascinating. And where did you
Yeah.
say that's going to be? Where is that right now?
Well, the exhibition of Blanche Ochede Monet,
Okay.
which kind of inspired this, and I wrote about that for that catalog, was is at the Eskenazi Museum at Indiana University
Okay.
in Bloomington, Indiana. So,
Fantastic. Right. Nancy, I can't thank you enough for this. This was a
oh,
wonderful
my pleasure.
talk. And thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for participating in our exhibition and participating in the catalog for the exhibition. Um, and Nancy has also graciously allowed us to record this presentation, so we will be posting it to YouTube in the coming weeks to our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch it again or, share this with other people, please do. And once again, our exhibition, Mary Cassatt, Berthe Morisot, Allies in Impressionism, is on view until, or through, I should say, September 1st. So once again, thank you all for joining us from all around the world. Nancy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin and Anne and everyone. I really appreciated having this opportunity.
And have